Let's go back now to our top story this hour, which is Bill Shorten's plan to reboot the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Catherine McAlpine is the head of Inclusion Australia. She joins us now. Hi, Catherine. Do you agree with Bill Shorten's view that the NDIA has lost its way?
I certainly agree that the NDIS could do with a reboot. What we know is that the NDIS was founded on the idea that we would do things differently, and in fact that's not really what we see happening right now, and so certainly we agree that it's time for a change and for some intervention.
Well, let's talk a bit about what Bill Shorten said today, because he really called out the misuse of NDIS funds, looking at waste, looking at unethical practices. In your view, how widespread are some of these unethical service providers? How many are problematic? What are the kinds of things that you're seeing that needs to be stamped out?
Yes, well, you see in the news about the blatant fraud and some of the things that are happening there, and we don't see much of that, but we do see what we call sharp practices. So we do see that providers push people for more time, that instead of maybe supporting someone into a local social setting that's more inclusive, that maybe the provider might set up a Friday night social setting for people with an intellectual disability. And so what we see is more what we would call sort of segregated and separated supports rather than inclusive, an inclusive approach that really makes sure that people are participating in their community. And
is that about the economic incentives for that provider, pushing them towards the things that maybe attract a greater subsidy or a greater fee than potentially the best outcome for that participant?
Yeah, it's a mix of the way that the NDIA funds things, in terms of they're more likely to fund something that's a specialist support rather than a mainstream support. But at the same time, there is a view by providers that participants come with packages, and the bigger the package, the better. And what we see, unfortunately, for a lot of people with an intellectual disability is what we sort of call client capture, where we see a person with an intellectual disability gets from the same provider, they live in a group home by a provider, they go to the ADE, so the old sheltered workshop, by the same provider, or the day program by the same provider, and then you see the same provider going, oh, we'll do some social activities on Friday nights as well. And so what happens is that people's lives are controlled by a single provider, and that is profit maximisation and inclusion minimisation, which is not what we want to see happen.
It just makes people feel insular, kind of closed off from the rest of the world.
That's right.
Bill Shorten used the phrase cash cows today, participants feeling like they're cash cows. Is that reflective of how participants in the scheme feel about, the services they're getting or the services they're sold?
It's a mixture. Like, one of the things I would say is there's been a lot of talk in the media recently about the cost of the NDIS, and participants have been incredibly worried, and particularly people with an intellectual disability who Inclusion Australia represents. What's really reassuring is to hear the Minister talk so positively about the commitment to the NDIS and the benefits, and that participants come first. So I think that's actually the first problem that people are worried about. But yes, for a lot of people with an intellectual disability, the NDIS is supposed to work as a market, so people with intellectual disability and their families should choose the best provider with the best outcomes. But what we do see is people respond well to people who speak to them respectfully, and so sometimes people are not really aware that while people are talking to them respectfully and nice to them in the program, that in fact maybe that's not in their best interests in terms of what their dreams and goals might be, in terms of inclusion or a job or living independently or doing something else a bit more exciting with their lives.
Well, let's talk about inclusion. You said at the start this was an opportunity. The NDIS was promised as an opportunity to do things differently. What does that look like if it's not what the scheme has been to date, or not been delivering on its promise?
Well, we think at the moment there's too many, because of the way that the trial happened and the in-kind supports by states. What we see is a lot of the old-style systems, so the old sheltered workshops and group homes, where we have tens of thousands of people with intellectual disabilities still in those settings, still going on in their old ways. And so what we want to see is something really new and innovative, where I think Bill Shorten was right when he talked about needing new options for home and living and accommodations. I think think that's absolutely right. What we want to see, but we also want to see the agency fund things, or states and territories as well as the agency. We agree that inclusion is everyone's responsibility, that the states and territories and the agency all think about what inclusive looks like, and that when that looks like inclusive mainstream systems, that the states and territories and the NDIS get their act together and make sure that the way the systems work, make sure that people can it's easy to get into the community, to get a mainstream job, to really live an independent, dignified life the same as the rest of us Australians do, and not get sort of down what we call the polished pathway into segregation, where all the systems work together to push you into segregation. We want to see the systems work together and push you into an inclusive life.
And just finally, Catherine McAlpine, we've heard a lot of talk recently about the costs of this scheme, about conversations about whether that needs to be reined in, the scope of the scheme might need to be changed, various ways you could change the NDIS. After hearing Bill Shorten's State of the Union of the NDIS today at the National Press Club, how are you feeling about the future of this scheme? Are you optimistic about the future?
Yes, we are optimistic about the future, but we also want all Australians to know that the benefits of the scheme are elsewhere. Like you heard Bill Shorten talk today about people not being in hospital, about people not maybe being in the justice system, that we see many more, families like myself working longer hours or back in the workforce. And so certainly the benefits of the scheme aren't necessarily measured in the scheme itself, in terms of, in some ways it doesn't matter what it costs if the benefits are even greater. So certainly we do feel optimistic, and certainly for the first time in a long time it feels like that we have a moment in time where the NDIA itself and government are listening to people with disability, in particular to people with intellectual disability, who make up probably a bit over 20% of the people in the scheme, and understand that things need to be done differently if we are to achieve the overall goal of an inclusive Australia.
Catherine McAlpine from Inclusion Australia, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Casey.